Hello and welcome to this edition of Fishology. For those of you who may be new here in Fishology, we go in depth on the Marlins in advanced stats. We look in deep dive in some analytical stats that maybe fly under the radar for most fans. And of course, joining me, we have Ely Sussman and our chief fishologist, Luis Addeo-Weiss. Guys, how you feeling for this episode? Looking at the Marlins players post All-Star break, comparing it to the first half of the year.
I'm really optimistic that this could be our best show yet, not just for content reasons, but Lewis is dealing with a bit of a sore throat. So that's going to be his biological warning when he's droning on a little bit too long to keep him in check, I guess. In all seriousness, I hope you're doing well, Lewis, in all seriousness.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to have my Jordan flu game tonight, so we'll see.
Well, we could start off with the Marlins version of Michael Jordan, at least for the second half, and that is Mr. Sandy Alcantara. When you look at his first half, the second half, it is just a tale of just two different players, two different just ways that he is performing. You look at the first half in 114 innings, a 4.72 ERA, a WHIP of 1.251. Strikeouts per 9 was 7. And then you look at his second half of the year, dropping all the way down to 2.7 ERA in 50 innings. His strikeouts per 9 all the way up to 8.5. WHIP even lower to a 1.0. Just a completely different player than he was in the first half. He's playing like the Cy Young Award winner last season. This is what the Marlins have hoped for Sandy for the entire season, and now they're finally getting it in the second half. Eli, just what are the Marlins getting now with Sandy in the second half? Just how well is he performing now?
This is closer to the version of himself that we expected. What I want to start off with is something that Lewis brought up to me a couple of days ago, which I think is a fair way to look at this, where it's not necessarily black and white that all of a sudden he's fixed or that necessarily he was terrible in the first half. What we've seen is that when you look at the fielder independent pitching and you look under the hood in terms of the strikeouts he's getting, the walks he's preventing, the home runs he's preventing, there's surprising similarities between the first half and the second half. In the first season overall, he has a FIP of 3.96, which is slightly better than league average. But if you look at what he's done in these games since the break, it's now 7 starts as we're recording this, entering Wednesday. The FIP has actually gone up to 4.21. So he's done that despite mainly because he's allowing more homers. There were things he was already doing well and just not getting great results in the first half. The main thing was his control was probably as good as we've seen it, really. He's been limiting walks at an amazing rate dating back to June. So that's been a part of him even through some, poor outcomes early on in the year. And that's still part of what he's doing since then. Most notably having a couple of games in here where he didn't walk any batters at all. So with him, it still doesn't feel to me 100% like last year in the Cy Young winning campaign. The main thing being that the changeup is still not an amazing put-away pitch that it was last year. By most measures, his changeup last year was as good as anybody's in terms of the overall run value. Nobody hit his changeup for a home run all of last year, and he's using it just as much this year. So the usage is the same. It's just the velo on that pitch is down a little bit. The location of the pitch hasn't been quite as good. The late movement on that pitch hasn't been quite as nasty, and that's still not totally there. But he's worked around that. I think he has finally recognized that this deep into the year that his changeup is not going to be it's not going to solve all his issues for him when he runs into issues with other stuff. Instead, we've seen him really utilize his fastball, I think, in more effective ways where he uses it both on the top of the zone, he uses it in the back door against right-handed batters to get more called strikes. So I think he's made some interesting adjustments, not fully returning to form, but overall, you still see much more good than bad out of him recently.
Yeah. Lewis, also with Sandy, I was mentioning his strikeouts per 9. Sandy's never been really that guy to give you 12, 13, 14 strikeouts a game. But just to see that number increase by a whole strikeout, going from 7 to around 8.5, almost 9. Do you see Sandy the way he's pitching in the second half of the season? Maybe differently? Is he locating pitches differently? Is he looking to get more whiffs, more guys to strike out compared to maybe it's just more weak contact and get guys out and maybe the other traditional ways?
I mean, the metrics may illustrate that he's pitching differently, but I still think his MO is kind of just like, let's work deep into games. And I think if you look since July 14th, which is the start of the quote unquote second half or post All-Star break schedule of games that we have, as we kind of wind down, he kind of continues to just do what he always does, and that's just efficiently give you innings. And like he gives you, and I did this search today on Fangraphs, and I made like a little spreadsheet, and I saw, so there's been 149 pitchers since July 14th. That's the first day of games in the second half of the season after the All-Star break to have thrown at least 20 innings. Alcantara and Luis Castillo, the Mariners, are the two pitchers with the most innings thrown in that span. So they've each thrown 50 innings in that span over seven starts each. And if you average that out, that's pretty Sandy Alcantara-ish. It's like a little bit more than 7 innings a start. It's about 7.1. If you really want to get pedantic about the math of that. But I don't necessarily, I mean, the approach maybe is a little more all or nothing. Like we saw that game against the Yankees where he struck out 10, but he threw 116 pitches and he went 9 innings. He was still kind of, his usual self. 116 pitch complete game isn't like insane, but it maybe raises a few more eyebrows in this era where we kind of baby pitchers. But I mean, he's kind of, if he's either not striking you out or he's, continuing to get ground balls at the rate that he does, he's become a little bit more susceptible, as Eli alluded to, with the home run. And that manifested no more than in August so far this month, where he, 2 of the 6 games he's had in his career of allowing at least 3 home runs have come this month alone. And, one of those was the Braves game. I understand that. Or I believe the other one was the game against the Rangers. And he just had a start recently where he did that. A lot of that is just because, maybe it's just the sinker. He's leaving more stuff up in the zone. He's not walking a lot of guys. And he, by FIP, he is among the luckier pitchers in this sample, too. He's, I believe, the 14th or 15th most lucky pitcher when it comes to ERA to FIP differential. And a lot of that is just because most of his fly balls are turning into home runs. I mean, his home run to fly ball rate is 22%. If that's not the highest in the majors during this span, it's pretty much up there. But, yeah, I mean, I don't know if he's necessarily altered anything in his pitch mix. I mean, his changeup really hasn't been what it was last year. He's still kind of sequencing similarly as far as just the dispersal of pitches. But, maybe it's just, he's, the home run bites him more, but he's still kind of giving you that length. It's just the results don't look the same. And the way I kind of see it, too, is his FIP is now more in line with his ERA. And that maybe, we kind of said at the outset of the season he was getting quote unquote unlucky. Maybe just Father Time is kind of showing everything to kind of come together closely. And maybe he's more of just a 4 ERA pitcher for this season than he was a guy who flirted with a sub 2 at parts last year. And that's just maybe more of what we're going to see. Because I think the differential in his ERA and FIP is like 0.15 at this point now. It's like 396 to 411. So it's not that far off. I think he's more of, he's not striking guys out more, but he is giving up more home runs. And that's just a product of maybe just the fly balls. And the BABIP would suggest too, it's more bad luck than good luck, because his BABIP is sub 260. It's like 257, 258. So I don't know. I mean, I think that this will normalize, but to be fair, he's just giving up a little bit more home runs. This isn't something that we normally see with him. So I don't know. It's an interesting stretch. It's like a mixed bag of success, although it's still his standard bulk success.
Yeah. Overall, I'll be encouraged when he's getting ground balls at about a 60% rate recently. That's going to allow you to overperform your FIP. Is when most of the contact you have is staying in the infield the way that it is. That's a pretty big key to me. Yeah, with him. But yeah, he's still working deep into games. He's on track to potentially lead the majors in innings pitched or finish right near the very top of that. So all things considered, he's not last year's version of himself, but there's a lot of similarities to the overall pitcher that we've seen the last 6 years overall in Miami.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, Lewis, and you mentioned really quickly his home runs. Does that worry you a little more to the towards when we get to the ending of the year? Because in the first half he had 11 home runs, and now he's given up 9 home runs in about half the innings and about half of those games played. Does that worry you at all for Sandy going into the rest of this season? He's giving up 9 so far since the second half compared to just 11 in that first half of the season.
I mean, he doesn't necessarily have a track record of it. I think, if the league continues to figure him out and he doesn't, find a way to maybe put more hitters away, that he may allow more home runs just because his reliance is so much on ground balls. And, Eli touched on the ground balls. He's got like the 5th lowest ground ball or the 5th highest ground ball rate in the majors actually since the start of the second half. So he's kind of just, it's weird. It's like 2 of the 3 pieces that make him successful, and the 3 primarily are, I would say average to about above average ability to put hitters away with strikeouts, the suppression of long balls, which he's done for the majority of his career. And for the first half, he had kind of kept on par with where he was for his career. And his ability to generate ground balls just about as good as anybody else. The home runs being a bigger concern, absolutely. Them coming with more frequency could scare you when you do consider that he just doesn't put hitters away. But then you also have to kind of remember that the stuff is such that he can kind of maybe work around it. And his command is very good to where I think he can. So it's a sequencing thing too. Like if he, location is kind of key in these instances. And if he's not, hitting his spots, and we've seen him a couple of times this year that some of the home runs he's given up, the one that sticks out to me is the 95-mile-an-hour sinker in that game against the Braves earlier this year, where he was coming off the bicep tendonitis, and then Acuna kind of took him deep. That's just maybe location. I don't know if maybe the workload is influencing this at all, but I'm concerned, but I'm not that concerned because I think that he's done what he's done long enough, where he's kind of been this weird anomaly of stuff, not equaling. Putting hitters away with the prolificity that we see most other power pitchers do it. But I think if this trend were to continue into, say, next year, then it would maybe be a problem. I think right now, no, because I just think this is just one of those years that's more akin to maybe like 2019, where he just wasn't who we have come to know and appreciate over the last 4 or so years. It's just a down year. It's just a post Cy Young kind of blues thing. But that being said, he's still, on pace to be about a 4-win pitcher. So for the money you're paying him, you're going to have the concerns are there, but I don't think they're at like a 3 or a 4 right now. And, if, this trend of long balls continues into 2024, that's when maybe you need to start raising some red flags about the way he's kind of going about approaching hitters.
So finishing off there with Sandy, Eli, with Sandy going into the rest of the season, you already had a couple complete games. How do you see Sandy faring off in the rest of the schedule? Do you see it more of the Sandy we've seen the second half, or do you think maybe he might go back to what we see in the first half, or is this just how Sandy's going to be for the rest of the season?
Yeah, I would go with the boring answer that I think he's just going to play up to his season averages moving forward. With this, when you look at some of the starts that he had in the first half, a lot of it was kind of intangible in terms of him clustering base runners at the wrong time, and that led to some of the kind of unlucky results. Like when he would struggle, it would all happen in the exact same inning, right? And he would allow a crooked number right there that would lead to more runs than you'd ordinarily expect given the overall quality of his outing. So that's why I don't put a whole lot of stock into the first half run prevention struggles, because that just felt a little bit unlucky in terms of the sequencing of when hits and when were happening to him. But this has been a really extended stretch in terms of limiting the walks. That's right up there with any 3-month stretch of his career in terms of every single time it's 2 walks or less, and more often it's 1 walk or less in these starts. So I think the second half version is a little bit more indicative of who he is than the first half. I'd lean in that direction, in a fairly positive direction. They need him to be anyway, because the majority of this rotation, especially as we're recording this, the Marlins don't really have a fifth starter whatsoever. And as we're about to touch on, one of their other key starters is struggling mightily. They absolutely need him to be close to continuing what he's been doing, if nothing else, by working deep into games, giving 7 innings a start. And I think he's still capable of that, working very deep into his games the rest of this season, going to the end.
So we're going to go transition from Sandy, someone who's had just an amazing second half of the season, to someone who is on the opposite end of that spectrum, had a really amazing first half of the year with a 3.29 ERA, a 3.21 FIP, to now looking at how his second half has fared in 28 innings in the second half of the season. Jesús Luzardo has a 7.39 ERA and a 6.73 FIP in those 28 innings since the All-Star break. Just a completely different pitcher than what the Marlins have seen in the first half. He is reaching a career high in innings pitched this season, but this is really a completely different pitcher than what the Marlins have had in the first half. Lewis, talk to us about Luzardo. What is going on with him? And are there any advanced stats or analytical points that really make up a reason to why Luzardo is struggling as much as he is?
I mean, he's getting absolutely clobbered. There's no dancing around that. Like, if you look at the opponent's slash against him in the second half, he's faced 135 hitters, and they're hitting a collective 322, 393, 620 against him. That's like MVP level Juan Gonzalez, like in the mid 90s, like steroid era offensive numbers. It's Ohtani-esque right now. I mean, if you really want to have like more of a modern comparison, and maybe even Acuna too. Like but the oddity of that is he's just kind of continuing to do what he normally does, and that's just miss bats. He's averaging still about 10 Ks per 9, so he's walking on average 4.5 batters per 9. So he's more of that 3 true outcomes type of player transposed to the mound, where you're still going to get – he's always kind of had that suspect command because he just throws so hard, and he's a lefty falling off to the side a lot. But I don't know. The barrel rate's not terrible. The hard hit rate is horrendous. I mean, it's 4th worst of the 149 pitchers with at least 20 innings in the second half. Like, I don't know. It could be the innings kind of creeping up on him, because I believe, what did he throw last year? Something like 100 innings. And, he quote unquote broke out. And for the most part, he did, but he, was kind of like AJ Puck, where he really didn't have like an extensive workload in the years preceding 2022. And now that he's thrown more innings than ever, maybe that's starting to wear on him a little bit. I mean, we spoke to him, it was after his first start of this month, and he told us that he felt fine and that his body was in a good position and mentally he was okay, but the results would indicate otherwise. I mean, he's been bad, but you still kind of see some things there with the continued ability to miss bats that would suggest, all right, like there's something here that suggests that, he'll turn this around. But to me, he's a very streaky pitcher. He had that game in Seattle, I think it was mid-June, where he gave up about 5 or 6 runs in 4 or so innings. And then he went on about a 4-start stretch where he was very good. And, even more, that was highlighted by those 7 innings against the Cardinals on, it was at the 4th of July. Like, he was tremendous. And then you kind of just, you had 3 runs here, 4 runs there. And now it's kind of just spiraled into this stretch where, he's allowing, hitters and OPS over 1,000 against him. And that's 6 starts. Like, that's about a month's worth of games. Pitchers can have a bad month, whatever the case may be. But, he's had really only one good start in that span, and that was that Colorado game. But other than that, it's just been hard to watch. I mean, if you on an ERA to FIP basis, it's very similar to Sandy's. ERA is 4.13, FIP is 3.93. Sandy's 4.11 to 3.96. So they've kind of been about the same pitcher. Sandy's just giving you more length, so he's sustained quote unquote better production over a longer stretch of innings, and he's leading the league in batter's face. I don't know. Luzardo is very volatile to me because when he gets in trouble, I mean, we saw against Houston, he gave up 3 home runs in the first inning. Velocity on the mound also equals velocity off the bat for the most part. It's very seldom that you have a guy who throws hard and can generate consistently weak contact, and we've seen it with him that when he's getting hit, he's getting absolutely destroyed. I mean, if the league is slugging Babe Ruth's career slugging percentage against you, then over a month's worth of time, then like there's a problem. And I don't, as far as pitch mix goes, I mean, Eli, like, what have you seen that leads you to believe that like there's just something in how he's going about hitters that's just making for this prolonged stretch of, I guess this is more of what we saw in 2021.
Yeah, this feels more like a pretty intangible slump with him. What I mean by that is there's no smoking gun. He has mentioned, at least in one of these post-game pressers, about just not having the feel for his slider, and that is his most important pitch going back to especially last year, and it continues to be. That's a pitch where he needs it to go from balls to strike to ball. He needs it to look like it's in the zone and then dip out and also throw it close enough to the zone that he gets hitters to chase it and competitively go after it. I think you can look at most of these starts and see that it's just not impacting hitters the same way. He's just not getting quite as many chases on that pitch when it goes down and in to right-handed batters and low and away to lefties. Like it's not quite deceiving hitters the same way as it was early in the year. Fatigue might have a role in that in terms of just repeating his delivery and making sure that he's in a position where the ball is deceptive coming out of his hands. I think that is part of it that's impacting him here. You talked about the Astros, that one inning. I wonder what sort of, when we mentioned Luzardo, I believe we did a pod mentioning him early in the year about how he was so awful the third time through the order and how he was a really impressive pitcher except for that. And both him and Sandy were struggling with it at the same time. And that's what makes these struggles so unusual, is that it's not, well, he's having enough trouble just getting to the third time through the order and staying in the game long enough. He's getting shelled immediately in several of these outings, which is uncharacteristic of him. So that speaks to me about a guy who's not, his delivery is not deceiving guys the same way that it was early in the year, but you could also give some credit just to the opponents being prepared for what they're going to see and some of the patterns potentially that he's falling into. I mean, Astros, trash can or not, they have this well-earned reputation of just being a very prepared team. As we're recording this right now, they had another big first inning, putting up several runs on an opposing team. They don't need to see you multiple times to get a feel for you. They're just traditionally a very prepared team coming into it. And that can be immensely frustrating for a pitcher when you feel like you're executing your pitches and still having trouble with it. What we've seen, one was Kyle Tucker, the other left-handed batter I saw it. And during the first half of the season, Luzardo only allowed one homer to a lefty the entire first half. He's already allowed a couple of those in the second half. So Corey Seager was the other one. So Seager and Kyle Tucker, those are just amazing players, though. So I think it's a lot of things going on here, including just the quality of the competition that he's facing in this sample. And it's a tough spot for the team to be in, where they really can't afford to give him a breather and take him out of the rotation, especially when the velocity is pretty close to what you'd normally expect from him. It's still in the high 90s most of the time with his fastball. So there's not like the glaring sign of wearing down that you sometimes see with guys that are not used to pitching this deep into the season. Yeah, it's a frustrating one, and the team just doesn't really have much of a choice than to just keep running him out there and hope that he makes adjustments.
One thing I will say too is, I don't know if this is just me reading Baseball Savant's pitch types and like the results on those, but do you think it's time that he just kind of does away with that sinker? Because for the most part, he really hasn't had a lot of prolonged success with that pitch. And I know he started throwing a cutter this season, and the sample is so small against it. It's about only like 11 plate appearances ending on the pitch, but he hasn't allowed a hit on it. And then I look at the sinker, and hitters are batting almost 360 on it, and the expected stats are not all that much better. But like, if you look at that pitch, it's consistently kind of been like a subpar offering from him. And, I don't know if maybe like eliminating that hurts him, but he also, like, I like his changeup a lot, and he doesn't throw it enough. I like the slider. A lot of the times when he's gotten hit too, that slider has hung in the zone, and it's not. And for a guy who throws 96 to 98, it's a pretty slow slider. I mean, you want variance and pitch velos, but it's 83 to 85. It doesn't really have it. It's got a lot of sharp bite at the end, but it's not thrown hard enough to where you're not going to run into a lot of hard contact on it. But the sinker is just like, that pitch to me is like wow. Like, it was better last year, but this year it's like hitters are feasting on that pitch. They have Luis Arraez's batting average, I think 358 on that pitch against him. So like, I don't know if maybe that's like something that maybe the ops team will look at this offseason and be like, all right, like his track record suggests that this pitch may just kind of like have worn out its welcome, because it just doesn't look like it's an effective offering at this point.
Yeah, I don't think he even used it in his last outing from what I can see. So that's the other. I do agree that seems to be like a weak link in it, and yet even when he kind of makes that adjustment, even when he's now toying around with this cutter, potentially as being a part of his mix, like it's still not. It didn't make a difference ultimately in his most recent flop that he had. So it is like there's a really complicated issue that he's having right now, and he's trying to make adjustments. And the Marlins have tried to make him as comfortable as possible by pairing him exclusively with Nick Fortes. He's always throwing to the same guy, the one who had a lot of success with him, of course, in the first half of the season and from us last year as well. So there's nothing really new when it comes to that either. But other than that, I mean, the next couple matchups, he's about to face the Padres as we're recording this. And then the next matchup after that would be, against against whoever they play. I don't know.
Rays?
I'm not the Rays, yes.
That's going to be. That might be a tough one.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not going to speculate too much on that with him. But either way, as long as he just stays available the rest of the year, this has been an important stepping stone for him to at least be able to make these starts, every scheduled start. He's the only guy in this rotation that has made every single scheduled start. Even Sandy got scratched one time. Braxton didn't start the year in the rotation. For Luzardo to at least stay in his normal routine throughout the entire year for a guy that had this well-earned reputation for not being durable, I mean, that's been the silver lining to it.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask you, Louis, as we're finishing up on Luzardo, I'm looking up some of his stats on Fangraphs and really looking up his second half. There are really like two numbers that really stand out to me in terms of just how he's been performing this second half. You could go his walks per nine going from 2.22 in the first half to almost doubling to 4.5, just showing how many walks he's been giving up per 9 innings. And then another one will be his BABIP. The BABIP he's giving up to players is 370, which is almost kind of like Mike Trout-esque numbers as a hitter. Just when I tell you these numbers, 4.5 walks per 9 in his BABIP as a pitcher going up these guys is a 3.7 compared to 3.15 in the first half. What does that tell you about Luzardo, or maybe key aspects of his second half pitching that have maybe faltered to the wayside in terms of his walks per 9 and where his BABIP is at compared to the beginning of the year?
I think that just kind of gets back to this idea of general fatigue, because you look at the FIP and it's not that much better. Now, I believe his XFIP may be slightly better, just as the way that Sandy's is about a run below what his FIP is, his actual FIP is. But again, I just think he's just, when he's missing with his slider, and he's kind of, and listen, maybe my hypothesis about doing away with the sinker wasn't a good thing, because I'm looking at his pitch breakdown now, and he's not throwing it that much anyway. He's still kind of getting rattled around. Yeah, I mean, if you're allowing a 310 BABIP, you're you're either in the midst of some bad luck or you're just kind of you're just struggling. And I would be more concerned with him because we've seen with Luzardo that he's had periods of his command abandoning him. And if you look at film, maybe that's abandoned it. His mechanics have somewhat abandoned themselves. But I don't know. He had that bad first inning against Houston, and then everything else was. I felt like that just felt like a culmination of just him pitching poorly. So I can't really assess anything beyond that. I mean, I just think that he's just going through one of those bad periods, and that's coming from a guy who I thought was saying he was going to be like a dark horse Cy Young candidate, and now he's kind of sitting here like flirting with a league average ERA, and I don't know. It'd be nice to see him turn around. I mean, Blake Snell to me is literally the same pitcher that he is, although he's having a lot better results. High walks and high strikeout totals, but I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's not encouraging that he's not pitching good against good opponents. Although that start against the Rangers wasn't terrible. I mean, it was still 6 innings, a 3-run ball. That's not all that bad, but at the end of the day, like when you haven't thrown this many innings before and you're going up against better competition and you're not performing, that's something that suggests that he could be a key cog in why they maybe don't go to the playoffs in the second half, because he has struggled and there's been very little light through the darkness that is that prolonged period of poor performance.
Yeah. And with Luzardo, again, looking at more of his stats, home runs per 9 up from 0.99 first half to 2.89 in the second half. And you mentioned his xFIP. His xFIP on the year is a 3.74, which is just about a little higher than what his regular FIP is and ERA. And Eli, when talking about Luzardo, we mentioned Sandy and how you think he'll just return almost kind of to form or what we expect from him in this season, how he's been doing. And with Luzardo, the way how just he's been performing this second half, is there a way for him to go back to the pitcher we saw in the first half? Or is that almost a lost cause for just taking someone who can maybe get a 4 ERA or anything like that? Oh, you're muted, Eli.
Because it's potentially both mechanical and mental and physical. There's just a lot of things going on here that I don't know which of those is easiest to remedy. And I mean, the whole confidence level aspect to it as well, where this is now an extended period of mediocrity that he hasn't had since late 2021. When he was going through it in 2021, the Marlins weren't playing for anything. So there was just no weight on his shoulders, even though he was struggling at a similar clip in August and September of that year when he first arrived to Miami. So it's a different problem for him to face and for him to overcome right here. The only thing I point to is that he has this now pretty lengthy track record of being a far above average pitcher prior to this recent slump that he can fall back on. And he's going during a period where I guess all you can point to is that it's a time where the Marlins have had frequent off days. So more often than not, he's going to have extra rest compared to what you'd ordinarily have if there is any concern about his, physical well-being. I think that can only help. The fact that he'll have a little bit more rest than he had for most of his outings during the first half of the season, going in between. What I mentioned before about how he's struggling from the get-go in some of these starts, it's happening early on. That's what makes it difficult for the team to protect him. Like if this was an issue like early in the year where he was running into a wall the third time through the lineup, this is the time of the year, especially when rosters expand, where you can protect him, where you just don't need to push him deep into games. But when he's struggling so much early on, that's, I guess, the only thing you could try to do is experiment with having an opener in front of him in some situations as well. I don't see the team going necessarily in that direction, though. So, I'm not as confident in him as I am with Sandy in terms of what to expect moving forward, mainly just because this is a foreign situation for him when you take all the factors into account.
Yeah. So that's going to be that for Jesús Luzardo. And we're going to go ahead and talk about another pitcher from the Marlins, and this one newly acquired in the trade deadline. So for this one, do you guys want to go more his post first half, second half, or maybe his time with the Mets and compared to the Marlins with David Robertson? How do you guys want to go about this one? Because it's kind of tricky in terms of it. You look at his time with the Marlins, 8 innings. His ERA is a 7.88. His FIP is a 6.64. Just not what the Marlins wanted when trading him. I know Alex Carver will talk about this forever if he could, and those players that they traded away. But how would you guys like to go about David Robertson?
There's not a big difference between those two areas to divide it, just because he only made 4 appearances between the All-Star break and the trade. The Mets weren't using him very often. A lot of that because the Mets were terrible and they weren't in a position to actually use a closer to finish off games during that span. So that's part of it as well. Yeah, with him, it is such a small sample that it's hard to really reach any strong conclusions about it. We know there's 3 notable screw ups that he had. The one against the Phillies, I think, which was his second appearance with the team, and that ended up turning a Sandy win that they were in line for into a heartbreaking loss. Then again against the Phillies in that same series, he allowed a go-ahead home run, and the team was able to overcome that in extra innings. And then most recently against the Dodgers, where allowing 3 runs in an inning, a combination of bad control and also just balls in play going against them in that aspect to reach us to this point. But it is fair to scrutinize him just because the standard is so high. Like, he was, a lot of ways you could slice it, he was maybe the best reliever that was actually moved at the deadline in terms of the first half performance, then ERA in the low 2s, and a lot of success in high leverage situations, especially given his long track record, his career heading into this year. Like, yeah, he held himself to a very high standard. So even having a month like he has had since then, in a small sample, like, that's notable because that's kind of unusual for him to struggle at that type of level. I mean, what I would just point to is it does seem to be his control is not quite as sharp as it was. He is getting himself into bad counts. There have been a couple times where non-competitive walks are extending innings, or they are just putting him in poor count situations where it makes him a little bit more predictable. And then I do remember that very first screw up, it may have been against the Phillies, when he allowed a game-winning home run to Nick Castellanos. And I hadn't actually noticed it at the time, but he had this like really funny reaction to this moment as well. Like, he knew immediately that he had screwed up, like doubles over in exasperation when Castellanos squares up that ball and hits it out for a game-deciding home run. So with him, when you look at his pitch location throughout the year with his slider, he throws both a curveball and a slider. He has had some instances this year where he leaves that slider over the middle of the plate, and that just makes it really hittable. Like, that's not necessarily a strength of his game. He wants guys to chase his breaking ball below the zone, and when he leaves it towards the middle of the plate, it is a very hittable pitch with him. So I would chalk most of this up to just getting into bad counts, and then even when he is throwing strikes, his command isn't as precise as it once was, and that's leading to some pretty crucial errors that to this point have made him a negative contributor to this team so far, despite all that they gave up to get him.
Yeah, you kind of took the words right out of my mouth as far as the command not being there. And you also have to remember too, like, Robertson, as great as he has been, hasn't always even been a closer. I remember he closed in a pinch a few times for the Yankees in prior years. And I believe he closed primarily with the White Sox. But even before that, he was kind of like a middle reliever, 7th, 8th inning guy. And we also have to remember, too, he doesn't throw 98. He was never one of those high-octane guys. He was always kind of a location-first, good cutter guy that he got by with, he balanced command and missing bats. And he was a very rare example of that in the bullpen, especially because he didn't never necessarily had the overwhelming stuff. to see him walk anybody is strange because his mechanics, if you watch footage of him from 2008 when he was, a baby in the big leagues, and you watch him now, his delivery is just about the same. Like he's maintained a very almost like Mario Rivera-esque ability to be very consistent with his delivery. And the problem is when you're throwing 92 to 93 and you're missing and you're gonna, it's gonna hurt. The funny thing is too, the Marlins really haven't been hurt too bad by way of him not being great because they're 6-2 in those games that he has pitched in. To be fair, one of them was an 11-3 blowout that he just kind of needed to get some work in against the Dodgers on Friday. But at the end of the day, it is concerning too that, as great as Robertson is, that the Marlins kind of initially before the Berger and Bell acquisitions were banking on him as like he's going to be this savior to an inconsistent bullpen. And then, you know what? The Fernando Rodney comparisons are apt. Although if you look at Rodney's first 8 games with the Marlins, they were actually a lot better. He gave up about 3 runs in those appearances, and Robertson's given up about 7 or 8, 7 earned and 8 total. I think he'll figure something out. I do need to remind other people, though, that there was a time a couple of years ago when he was just about out of the big leagues entirely. So, because I believe he signed a 2-year deal with the Phillies, he pitched a few games, had Tommy John, and then he kind of went away, and everyone's like, is David Robertson done? And he comes back, and he's had, almost like a second life. Of course, revived by the Rays, and then he returns to the Philly and is great the next year. But I still think there's a lot of volatility with a guy who doesn't overpower you, and he's a guy who gets by on guile and command. And the thing is like his ERA to FIP is very much in that ballpark. You can surmise that his struggles are just kind of bringing his ERA closer to what his FIP suggests he's been for a majority of the year, and maybe he ends more as a 3.5 guy and rather than a sub 2 guy that we've seen him be at various points throughout his career. So I don't know. It's concerning. I don't know if I want to change closer yet because like Puck has seemingly done better in these quote unquote lower leverage situations. Getting it out here to end an inning and then starting an inning fresh, and the ninth inning. The troubles of the ninth inning don't necessarily phase him. But that just goes to show you, closing is a different animal. I mean, good example, if you're a Marlins fan, you remember Kyle Bearclaw was electric in the 7th and the 8th inning, striking out, 13, 14 guys per 9. But then when you throw him into the 9th inning, and we even saw that at early points with Cishek too, your equilibrium kind of gets thrown off. It's, it's more make or break than anything else. Robertson's experience, I think, will prove maybe to be better for the Marlins than what we got for the most part with those guys. But I still think that there is volatility. You also have to remember he's 38. Like, he's been in the big leagues forever. So there's the track record, but then there's also the fact that he's just so old and, by baseball standards that this could fall and hit the Marlins like a, rake in the face kind of situation. But, I think he's been so good for so long that part of me is still holding out and thinks that he'll be fine in the long run, but they do need him to be better than he has been for sure.
Yeah, and with Robertson, the way he's been performing, let's say he gives another performance like he did in his last outing. How would you guys view him the rest of the way, or maybe what's the length of his leash? Does he have a short leash? Does he have a relatively long one just because he was traded for and the players that they gave up for him? At what point is there, or at any point, is there a way to go? Marlins, maybe new closer, put someone else in there, or if no matter what David Robertson puts out, he will be the closer for the Marlins.
What I think is clear is that he's not the best reliever on this team. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if there's a path for him to be it unless Tanner Scott falls off, because Scott has been amazing this year. And the context behind Robertson's most recent blown save is that he was pitching in the 8th inning because they wanted to use Tanner Scott against the best hitters in the Dodgers lineup in the 9th inning, assuming that Robertson could get through the 8th. So it's already clear that Robertson's not number one in this bullpen. You can even make the case as to whether him or Andrew Nardi is the one you'd rather have behind Scott in the second most important situations, that itself is already relatively clear. So I am hopeful, and I would be supportive if they've reached a point where Scott simply is the guy that faces the toughest hitters in those late situations, and that I don't think at the moment that Robertson is the full time closer even now. That it'll be a situation where they recognize that Scott has just been so terrifically consistent throughout this year that he will be the one that that when they have an opportunity to choose between the two in particular matchups, that Scott will be the one that simply faces the better hitters, especially if they hit from the left side. Other than that, there's just not room to drop him much farther in the pecking order than that. The reason why they got him is because they were thin on reliable right-handed relievers, and they still are. The Jorge Lopez trade has not panned out much better than the Robertson experience so far. Obviously, Dylan Floro was traded to get Lopez. Huascar Brazoban is hurt. We don't know if he's coming back this year. Matt Barnes is out for the year. JT Chagua is about to come back from his injury, but he wasn't pitching particularly well before then. They don't have good alternatives, especially when it comes to guys from the right side. So with Robertson, there's enough to like about his stuff and his experience, and that I think he's going to continue to receive important opportunities as long as I think everybody should be on the same page. That Tanner Scott is the one who, when we get super late into this year into absolute must-win game scenarios, I think even Skip Schumacher is he's going to go down with his very best, and his very best is Tanner Scott.
Yeah, same question to you, Lewis. Just how do you view Robertson now in this bullpen? First, when he was traded to Miami, it seemed like maybe he was maybe the right-handed reliever for the Marlins, to now where he's fallen out almost out the pecking order for a closer compared to the Tanner Scott and maybe even Andrew Nardi. Just how do you view Robertson along the way?
I mean, I'll just kind of pivot back to what I said before and just kind of say that I think Robertson's experience over everybody else will give him a little bit more of a leash. That being said, they've given how fragile the pitching staff is as a whole right now, they don't really have a lot of room to make mistakes. I think that, say, tonight, when we're recording this on Tuesday, if the Marlins have a lead in the ninth, he will be the guy to get the ninth inning. Tanner Scott is your best reliever, but even then, we remember that he was terrible as a closer last year, and a lot of that was because of one of the things that has plagued Robertson in his early Marlins tenure, though not to the degree of that it did Scott, who did this over a longer sample, and that's the lack of command. And if that abandons itself, and we've seen that Scott has been susceptible to that, then there may need to be a change. The problem is that at the beginning of the season, Skip said that the closer, the role was going to be closer by committee, and so that would suggest the fluidity was going to be there, that there would be a myriad of guys getting opportunities. The only reason we've really seen that is because Puck kind of lost that role. And now Robertson, I don't want to say he's in danger of losing it, but I think they're going to have to get creative if this doesn't somewhat sort itself out. I think maybe he has 2 more outings at most to put things together as a Marlin before they kind of pivot in the direction of maybe giving somebody like Scott a shot again, at least at closing, because he hasn't really done it under Skip's tenure.
Yeah. And going from Robertson, really quickly, we can mention someone I know Eli wanted to talk about, Luis Arraez, and just how he's been performing. I could tell you really quickly his first and second half. First half of the year, 383, 434, 471 for a 905 OPS. To now where he has gone down in every single one of those categories. Obviously, wasn't going to maintain a 383 batting average, but still under 300 maybe for what Luis Arraez has to be given to the Marlins. People may have expected a little more in terms of where he's at, and now 297, 319, 435 slugging for a 754 OPS, and probably the most drastic number of them all in terms of how he's fallen off from the first to second half will be that on-base percentage, going from 434 to a 319, just not walking as much, striking out more than he's walking in the second half, and just 120, 115 point difference in terms of his on-base percentage. So Eli with Luis Arraez, just what is going on with him with the potential Silver Slugger batting champ?
Man, well, the story of Arraez, what makes him a freak is that not only does he make incredible contact with in terms of the frequency of his contact, but he always finds holes in the defense. And that's the thing that is just not the latter part is not happening over this last month or so, where his BABIP has gone so far down, as we have a chart on the YouTube version, where it's like almost league average over the last 30 games or so in terms of his BABIP, down to 309 during this 30 game sample, whereas league average is in the high 290s with him. So I don't think there's really a deep issue here other than it's a little bit of regression to the mean. He was a guy that was BABIPing in the 400s for a good portion of this year. And nobody really does that over the course of a qualified season, especially if they're not hitting the ball hard, which Arraez doesn't quite do. So, yeah, this isn't really a surprise. I think most of us saw this coming, that he's probably going to win a batting title. It's just he's not going to flirt with 400 while he's doing it. Like, this could be a career year for him, and yet it still would not – he didn't really have a chance of maintaining what he was doing before. We're still getting the best version of himself. It's just water's kind of finding its level a little bit with this approach. Like, this approach still has – there is a ceiling on what you can accomplish with the skill set that he has. You just don't crush the ball, and you very rarely hit the ball over the wall. In fact, but I do think the longest home run that he has hit in the big leagues, that actually happened during the second half slump, is that he did show that he could still launch it 400 feet under very particular circumstances with him. I did just want to acknowledge it on the show because that is a clear big split between the first half and the second half. And the Marlins have gotten good offense from a couple of their bats, including the new guys, Josh Bell and Jake Berger. But the reason why the offense as a whole isn't performing at a great level consistently, one of the big reasons why is simply that Arraez is no longer superhuman, that he's come back down. So I do expect him to, if nothing else, revert to his career averages. I expect him to be better than a 300 hitter the rest of the year. But there are just limitations because he is so aggressive. He's not going to walk very much. He's not going to hit for much power. So it's going to be, I think he's still a 300 hitter the rest of the year, but it'll be a fairly empty 300 hitter. And I think people should just adjust their expectations accordingly. And you'd hope that Skip manages accordingly as well. And, not relying on him to always save the day and to carry the offense on his own. He's just not really that type of player if you look at the true talent level.
Yeah, his offensive depressive episode, if you want to call it that, it's still a prorated hit total of 195 over the course of a full season. And I mean, he's never hit below 294 in a full season anyway. So he's kind of maybe just having that 2019 that he had where he wasn't great per se, but still better than what most would give you. Listen, I have noticed too, and I was listening to the broadcast the other day, and Rod Allen pointed out that the outfielders are actually playing him a little bit more shallow. So some of the line drives that he had earlier in the season that were falling are now kind of landing in the gloves of those outfielders because they're not playing him as deep. Because, for the most part, when Arraez beats you, he's hitting the ball up the middle, or he's kind of directionally hitting it at the spot where the third baseman and the shortstop aren't standing. And he's just kind of, as Eli said, finding the holes, on the field. Listen, like a 350 season is going to look like this. It's going to have a 2-3 even week period, even a month where a guy is hitting below what the batting average would suggest. So I think that you kind of just have to bear with it and hope that he kind of snaps out of it. I mean, he even had an over 16 stretch at one point, and he snapped like 110 game or so streak of striking out less than 2 times in a game, and then he did that 2 times in like a week. Like, that's gonna happen even for a guy who strikes out less than 50 times a year most of the time. So I think you kind of just have to bear with it. As you said, Eli, there's limitations in a guy who's not gonna hit you 10 home runs in a season. Tony Gwynn went through periods like this, though I don't think he ever struck out as much in said game span as Arraez did. But you kind of just have to let the guy figure it out. I think he's such a pro and he's such a good hitter. He's very hard on himself to the point where he's almost like that what Jose Altuve was at some point, where if he wasn't getting 2 hits in a game, it was an abject failure for him. And I think Arraez maybe even as fans, we've come to expect that from him. And when he doesn't do that, it's just like, it's weird even when he only gets one hit. And you're like, getting a hit in the big leagues is hard anyway. But like when he's struggling and he's still hitting 290 over a month's worth of games now, like you have to be pretty good about who's playing second base for you. The one thing that may concern me though is there have been several times recently where he's gotten hurt, like experienced some injuries mid-game. Like we saw yesterday, sliding into third base, looked like he did something with his thumb, and I know he left with what they described as stomach cramps. There was even something at fielding a ball recently. Running down the line, it looked like he had something with a hamstring a couple of weeks ago. So, like, he may be a little banged up. Like, we haven't even touched on that. Like, we talked about Luzardo being fatigued. Arraez may just be like, he's never played second base for this long over the course of the season. Played mostly first base last year. The longer defensive load at more of a premium position could be kind of catching up with him. Though it didn't early, it may be now. And talk about the shift in the outfield with guys kind of playing him a little bit more shallow, you're going to see that batting average kind of revert to what we've kind of come to see more. If he hits 330, it's still a tremendous year. It's just, like even the great hitters struggle. He's going through that, though it's a lot less of a struggle than what most guys would want,
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect way to end it there with Arraez. So talking about all these guys from their first half to the second half, really looking at their splits, a lot of different ways, some positives, some negatives, but all look to be hopefully in better shape by the time this next series rolls around. So that's going to do it for Fishology. For myself, Daniel, for Eli, for Lewis, keep watching, keep listening. We love doing Fishology, and always go fish.